Welcome to Hope at Night, featuring Caleigh Weichbrodt, Thomas Luttrell, Q&A with our live audience, and host Anil Kanda. Today's episode, how can I experience true intimacy? And here's your host, Anil Kanda.
The website known as OnlyFans seems to be surfacing more and more in the news today. There are stories of kids being targeted when others find out their moms are on OnlyFans. There are also stories about former teachers quitting their jobs only to make $1 million by putting suggestive pictures of themselves on this subscription-based site. Many are shocked to learn that women can make up to $5,000 a day posting pictures of their toes, while others are even more baffled at the fans who are forking out funds for their feet fetishes. But services offered by OnlyFans content creators have been around for a millennia. Humans were created to enjoy love, sex, and intimacy. But can we get our solutions to these needs muddled up, leaving us empty and unfulfilled? Our first guest today is a former model who offered extra services for a price, making thousands of dollars as a highly paid escort to be at someone's beck and call. It seemed to be a life that others could only dream of. So why did she give it all up? Let's find out more once we welcome to Hope at Night, Caleigh Weichbrodt. Caleigh, glad you're here. Caleigh, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you grew up?
Yeah, so I grew up in a really small town in Tennessee. I had lots of siblings, and my parents were very involved in the Christian community. Then, after a little while, my parents had a super messy divorce. There was an affair, and things just kind of fell apart from there. Yeah.
What seemed to change in your life as you grew up?
So going from being really tied into this close-knit community of people we trusted and friends to then having separate homes to go to and hopping around to different churches, we ended up in a church where there was a lot of shame. There was a lot of judgment and just this picture of a God who was very unloving and harsh and who was kind of waiting to call you out when you messed up, but wasn't like a champion for you.
I can see why you would not want to be around this God.
It was not a God I was interested in. And so even though I would have said I was saved up to that point, at 13, I renounced my faith and became an atheist.
Wow. And so as you begin to embrace atheism or felt that you had no more need of God or didn't want to be around this God that you grew up hearing about, what began to change in your lifestyle as you became an adult?
Well, one of the things was I discovered pornography at a pretty young age. And this is, I guess, a little bit before that decision to become an atheist, but I think it's important for where I ended up because that was a big entry point for a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, where I knew it was wrong and I didn't like the way it made me feel, but it started to completely shape the way that I saw sex and sexuality. And so once I became an atheist and decided I was my own God, I was going to make the rules. I wasn't going to feel ashamed anymore. I wasn't going to feel guilty for the things that I wanted to do. And as a teenager, I'm sure most people can admit that being curious with other people is something that a lot of teenagers are interested in. And so I became really promiscuous in high school. And wasn't in high school for very long before I got scouted to become a model.
How old were you at this time?
16.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay. What did your family think about this?
When I talked to my mom about why she let me do it, she said, you were so persistent that if I didn't let you go, you would have bugged me about it.
Right.
So I went off to LA by myself at 16 for 2 months. I started in that whole world of, something that looks really glamorous.
That seems very glamorous for many people, but what began to change over time?
So, from the get-go, when I went to LA, I started dating a guy who was 10 years older than me. So if you do the math, I was 16, he was 26 years old. And he happened to be connected to some pornographic actors out in LA. So he was kind of asking if I would be interested in doing some filming. And I'm really grateful that I never went full on into that, but I definitely considered entering the world of pornography at that point. Before I was brought back home for a season. So from there, this search for love and connection and adventure, honestly, just kept spiraling. I went to Asia for a period for modeling as well. And the curiosity just continued.
Right. So you, from what you're sharing is, being exposed to pornography, to the interest to modeling, and then being around lifestyles that were far different than what you grew up with or were exposed to, right?
Absolutely.
So you eventually got involved into another kind of business. What was that?
So it was through a website called Seeking Arrangements, and there had been some articles out there blowing up about how much money you could make. And at that point, I was already sleeping around so much. I was like, why wouldn't I get paid for it? I didn't have, it wasn't a traditional style of prostitution where you have a pimp, and I got to choose. And so I was like, this is kind of the best of both worlds. I get to make money, go on trips, the clothes, all the things, and get paid for it.
Right. It sounds like when you hear stories of people who have gone through this similar journey, they describe just sort of these paths or these steps in succession that led them down. Oftentimes, just the desire for glamour and for fame, and then it eventually leads down just this darker path.
Yeah.
What was life like for you emotionally throughout all of this?
It was really lonely. I was so focused on sex and relationships that I didn't prioritize friendships at all. And so everyone in my life was someone that I was either sleeping with or had slept with. They're not people I could carry with me through life. They're not people that I was building life with. And so it was incredibly lonely. I was anxious, I was depressed, but I probably would have told you that I was really happy.
Right.
I had coping mechanisms like smoking cigarettes and drinking and occasionally doing drugs that kind of helped to numb how bad I felt inside.
Isn't that interesting where there's a portrayal of celebrities, singers, musicians, you name it, and their whole life seems to be full, at least what is portrayed, of happiness and joy, excitement, but deep down there is just this emotional disturbance, this loneliness that's there, right? Throughout all of this, what finally led you out of this experience?
So things were kind of drying up modeling-wise. I was getting old for the industry at 23. And one of my arrangements...
Wait, I got to follow up. So generally modeling is from, what are the prime time ages for that?
16, 17, they kind of get you groomed and primed for work. And then by, 19 to 22, that's when you're really supposed to cash in and make all of your money.
Wow. So in 23, they think that, is it because they believe that, hey, there's wrinkles? You don't look like you have wrinkles. So,
Well, so I think it also depends on what look you're shooting for. And so
Gotcha.
I was the girl next door. I shot a lot of junior stuff. So I looked old to be a teenager. And so I just started noticing my regular clients would replace me. A girl with a similar haircut, but not me. And so I was like, okay, that's kind of drying up. And this arrangement, that was really creating a lot of a safety net in my life. He decided that he was kind of done with the whole thing and backed away. One of my really close friends that we had gotten involved with each other, that relationship ended, and I was like, I think it's time to leave. So I moved back home, which my parents had migrated to Florida, and that's where I got involved with someone else who brought me to church.
Wow, so you met somebody who was a Christian,
Yeah.
and you started to go to church again. So.
Well, he wasn't even a Christian.
Okay.
He just his family had a church. And so we were just going to visit them. But I mean, it's funny that God knew the only way he was going to get me into a church building was through a guy. And so we started going to visit his family, and then out of respect, just attending services. And they had an amazing Celebrate Recovery program.
What exactly is Celebrate Recovery Program? I've seen that around in different places,
Yeah.
different churches. What exactly is that?
I love it because it's not about a specific addiction. It's about looking to a thing to fulfill you that isn't going to. And so anybody with any kind of addiction can go to a Celebrate Recovery and go through the steps of just admitting there's a problem and this isn't helping me, and it's not leading me down a path to a fulfilling, happy, wholesome life, and I need help. And it's a lot of testimony sharing, people who've been in the program longer, who've found that hope, who've found that freedom, and also they share a lot about grace. And that was a part of God that I really hadn't heard very much about.
Did you find very authentic people in the Celebrate Recovery Program?
Yes, people who were willing to be honest with their doubts, their questions, the fact that they were still in process, that they hadn't like immediately discovered and had this 180, but they were getting there. They had something that I knew I didn't have, and I knew I needed.
Isn't that interesting that honesty, authenticity with yourself, with others, with God is oftentimes the very first first step of healing, isn't it?
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
So here you are, you're in the Celebrate Recovery Program, you're meeting good people. It seems to be a time of healing. I thought you were an atheist.
Me too.
So what began to change regarding God for you?
When I heard about the possibility of a kind of love that sounded like the thing I'd always wanted,
Incredible.
I was like, maybe I could give it a shot. I mean, that would make me one of those crazy religious people, but like, I was so desperate for love that I had to try. And so one night I'm at the church on a Tuesday night, sitting there. There's no sinner's prayer, there's no altar call. I'm just like, okay, God, if you're real. And it felt like my faith to just crack the door, open the floodgates, and I physically felt this love wash over me. In that moment, I knew everything that I had done was wrong, but I felt so loved, and it made no sense to me. It made no sense how I could be confronted with the fact that like none of this stuff was good for me, but it was also never what he intended for me. It wasn't what he designed me for, and from that moment, things have just never been the same.
You know, your story reminds me of the story of the Samaritan woman who meets Jesus at the well. And, you know, it comes out that she's had, you know, multiple relationships. But what's so beautiful about that story is Jesus never left the conversation. he stayed right there. And it's just this beautiful understanding that when you're fully known and fully loved,
Yeah.
that it begins this space, this place of healing and growth and recovery and just a changed trajectory of life.
Absolutely.
So what has life been like for you since that?
Well, so I had this idea that life was going to be a cakewalk with Jesus, that you get saved, you're instantly a better person, and like he's just going to make my path straight. He's just going to like work everything out. And life has been so beautiful, but so challenging since then. A few years in, I realized that there was not a lot of fruit being produced in my life. And what I mean by fruit is the fruit of the Spirit, patience, love, kindness, gentleness, these things that I thought Jesus was just going to give me. I didn't realize how much of the old life I was still holding on to, that I wasn't ready to let go of. And so I feel like 2 years ago, there was a huge shift where it was like, all right, I really need to grab hold of him. I really need to take this seriously if I want to see the change that is promised to me in the Word. And the catalyst for that really was my dad was diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer 3 months after I had my son. So I'm married and I have a child at this point. My dad gets cancer. And I remember running and just praying and crying and being like, God, why is this happening? Like, what in the world is going on? Nothing makes sense. And he said, but you're talking to me, aren't you? And it was like this realization that if I didn't have the Lord, just thinking like, how would I be coping with this right now? What would I be turning to? And none of those things seemed appealing to me anymore.
What kind of decisions did you decide to make as you were going through this experience that led to greater growth and change in your life?
I decided to get serious about some spiritual disciplines. So being in the Word, reading my Bible, praying a lot, and going back to the intimacy and the vulnerability, just letting my heart out to the Lord instead of trying to be good. And kind of getting back into this performance piece of like being whatever he wanted me to be and just instead being me, where I was, and letting him deal with it. That really changed. Also, developing a practice of worship, just putting worship music on and again, letting my heart out to him and letting him show up for me.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Caleigh, what would you say to somebody who is maybe struggling right now? Maybe they're not in the modeling, business, or maybe they are. Maybe it's a different kind of business, or regardless of what's going on, maybe they're surrounded by lots of people, yet they feel incredible loneliness, or there's great shame and guilt, and just keeps them in these cycles. What would you tell that person?
It's time to get honest. It's time to get honest with yourself that you do feel lonely, that you do feel ashamed. And I believe that in that place of honesty, God will meet you there. Because he loves us where we are, but he also loves us enough to help us change.
Beautiful. Caleigh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Caleigh Weichbrodt, a former atheist and highly paid escort who now seeks to use her online presence to share how God has changed her life. When we come back, we'll meet a marriage and family therapist who works with the men who seek these services. So don't go away. Welcome back to Hope at Night. Earlier, we met Caleigh Weichbrodt, who once thrived on making money by selling herself for money and attention. We'll find out more about the topic of true intimacy with our next guest, a licensed marriage and family therapist who works a lot with couples and sexuality. He is a former associate professor of psychology and currently serves as a pastor. Let's welcome to Hope at Night, Dr. Tom Luttrell. Dr. Luttrell, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thank you.
I have a question, very important question that will start off this conversation. That is this: what is intimacy? When you're looking for a definition of that word, what would you say is the definition of the word intimacy?
Well, it comes from a word that basically means to make known. And so for me, intimacy is all about fully knowing people, knowing yourself, knowing your partner or your loved ones, and knowing God. And so intimacy is really just about a full knowledge of people, yourself,
Yeah, I've heard the phrase intimacy, in to me,
Yeah.
see, right?
Exactly.
Now, how did you get interested in the subject of authentic intimacy?
Well, it really goes down to my own personal backstory. I grew up in the church. I was always in the church. But just because you're in the church doesn't mean you have everything right, In fact, there was a time when I was a young leader in my church. I was involved in speaking and teaching, and yet on the weeknights we would go out and do crazy stuff, which I don't want to get into here. But some of the things I wasn't very authentic. And one morning, I'll just share with you the story just so you understand where I came from. I actually was just laying in bed. And in my alarm clock, the old alarm clocks that goes, like a radio alarm clock,
Right.
And it has a buzz. Well, anyway, this morning, instead of the usual buzzer, it goes this static. And as I'm laying there, I hear this voice that comes over and it says, "Are you faking your walk with God?" And I slammed that off and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't.
What an early morning wake-up call.
I know, right? Literally a wake-up call. And I kept thinking, like, wait a minute. Is that you, God, asking me, am I faking my walk with God? And I'm like, look at all the things that I'm doing. I'm leading and teaching. But then as I was really upset for like a week or so. And then I thought about this. I felt like this dark cloud following me. But then I realized that, God isn't trying to get me or make me feel bad. Like you were saying, he's not out to get us. He just wants me to have a real, authentic relationship with him. And ever since then, I've made it my life mission and my life goal to try to have an authentic relationship with him. And that's trickled into, my work as a therapist and as a pastor. I want to have an authentic relationship. And that includes all areas, including our sexuality.
Dr. Luttrell, what makes it so hard, so challenging for people to be authentic, to be themselves truly?
Several things. I think first of all that comes to my mind is that we feel like we're going to be judged. I think of the story of how Adam and Eve in the Bible, when they sinned, they did something they knew was wrong, they immediately went and ran away and hid because of that shame. They're afraid of what would happen if they were found out. And I think that's how a lot of us feel. We don't want to be exposed because we're afraid of being judged. What's going to happen if someone finds out? And so I wanted to be authentic, but at the same time, I didn't really have the tools, or I wasn't fully equipped because I still struggled. Even after I said I want to be authentic, I couldn't get rid of them on my own. I would try and a lot of us, people will have these things that we just can't get rid of. I think for me, the biggest thing that made a difference was just coming to realize that God accepts me as I am. I can just be who I am, and I can be authentic with him. And I just said, God, I have this issue I can't let go of. Please help me. And a lot of people will think, oh, you're just going to accept it. You're just going to endorse it. Well, I didn't want to accept it, but I had to just recognize it is what it is. And once I allowed that to happen and it gave me a sense of peace. Just, I'd have to struggle with this. But what's funny, that thing that I couldn't give up, it no longer had power over me. Incredible. And eventually it just went away on its own. I didn't have to beat myself over the head trying to get rid of it. It just disappeared because I didn't have that desire like you were talking about. Once you have that desire that's changed, you naturally want to respond in an authentic way. And so that's why I help a lot of guys with substance abuse, a lot of men that I work with who struggle with pornography addictions because of, they're looking for something and they, just doing some superficial behavioral change, like installing some software isn't going to cut it, because if there's a will, there's a way. What they need, right? What they need is a life transformation.
Why is authenticity connected to sexuality?
Well, because we can't talk about these things that are so vulnerable to us if we think we're going to be judged for it. And sexuality is one of those personal things that are so important to us, and yet and look at how often we judge these situations. I mean, even these are such controversial subjects as it is to talk about. And, I know for a fact that a lot of pastors struggle with pornography, and yet they can't talk about it because maybe they're put on a pedestal and they're afraid, if I talk about it, what are people going to think of me? And so, like, for me, as a pastor, I try to model the safe space so we can talk about things and they don't have to worry about being judged.
Dr. Luttrell, when you think about sexuality, why is it that there is so much shame particularly connected to, sexual mistakes? Why out of anything else,
I know,
it seems that there's a great degree of shame connected to that. And it's not even something that is brought on through people, others, or an external environment, but sometimes very internal. Why is it something that affects us so deeply?
That's a really good question. I don't think I have the full answer to that. We tend to obsess about these kinds of subjects, and maybe there's a psychological level why we obsess about these things. And I don't really know if I have the answer. I just know that we tend to make a big deal about these things, and it may have something to do with purity culture and stuff like that.
Caleigh, what do you think?
So when I decided that I was going to write my own rules and leave shame behind, what I found was not freedom from shame, because there's knowledge inside of all of us about what's right. God wrote that code on the inside of us. And so I think that there's a lot of shame around sexual sin because we know deep down it's not good for us. It's not the ideal scenario. And there is so much freedom when you're in intimacy with someone that is your spouse, and you are able to let go of that fear and experience true intimacy. When you experience that, oh my gosh, this is an experience that has no shame attached to it. But without that experience, it's sort of like you just think that, it's shame is just kind of a part of sexuality, but it's not supposed to be.
It's not supposed to be.
Right.
God created sexuality, right?
Yeah,
Right.
And he called it good. So,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, that's fine. I appreciate that. In fact, it reminded me of something I wanted to say, that a lot of times I feel like the church feels they have a responsibility to tell people that what they're doing is wrong.
Right.
But as you said, I really think that we don't need to say as much as we think we do, because the reality is that a lot of people already know. People ask me all the time this question, like, yeah, Pastor Tom, do you think it's okay to do this and that? Right? And I'm like, why don't you pray about it and see what God says? At one time this guy asked me this question, like, is it okay if I look at porn with my wife? And, I don't want to get into the moralistic answers, because I'm not your Holy Spirit. You got to figure things out for yourself, right? Obviously I could give him an answer, but I just asked him, so what if you prayed about it with your wife and talked to her about it? How do you think they would answer? He was like, man. What? Because he already knows the answer. He doesn't need me to tell him that.
That's right.
And unfortunately, too many times in the church, we feel like we have to tell people.
That's right.
Like they already feel it in themselves,
Right. It's so interesting when you're studying out the Gospels. One thing you find is the tax collectors and sinners, it uses that phrase sinners, felt they could be in the presence of Jesus. They couldn't be in the presence of the Pharisees, but they felt they could be in the presence of Jesus. It's fascinating.
Let me ask you this. Do you think Christians are more likely to be authentic or not? What do you think?
You know what? I think humans are humans inside the church and outside the church, right?
Well, let me just share with you. I was once working at a Christian counseling center and at a rehab, right? Who do you think is more likely to be vulnerable and opening up to me? Not the Christians. That's sad, right? And why? I think it's because we have such high expectations for ourselves and each other that we don't feel safe to be able to open up and talk about the things that struggle with us. And I'm like, I know what you're dealing with. You know, you don't have to try to pretend to be something you're not. It's okay. I accept you. And too many times, oftentimes it's the person who's hit rock bottom, who's already been exposed, they've gone through the criminal justice system or something, because it's already out there. They're the most easy to talk to about God, because they already know that they need something. But sometimes when we're trying to put on a pretty face, it's hard to really be authentic.
Dr. Luttrell, what does inauthentic intimacy look like?
Oftentimes I think it's being basically fake, you know, and it's looking for the things that don't truly satisfy. I mean, you know, whether it's pornography or it could be somebody who, I think of so many guys who are looking to pay for intimacy. I'm like, well, that's really sad. You know, you can just have a real relationship, right? And yet they pay somebody to make them feel connected, right? And I'm like, you know, they're just using your money. Don't you realize that? You know, and yet it gives them the sense of feeling connected. And at the end of the day, they're going to feel empty and alone still. You know,
it's so fascinating. As you're talking, I was just thinking about some stats that show that people are getting married at a much later age today. But even more specifically, men are getting married much later in age. What do you think are some of the contributing factors?
You know, I haven't looked exactly at the research, but I can tell you there's a lot of other reasons, like, you know, people are postponing things for career and stuff like that. But when it comes to intimacy, I think people are, they're scared of real intimacy, or they're finding substitutes in other ways, whether it's virtual girlfriends or porn or something, you know, and they're just not feeling that need. But the reality is, and this is why I talk about authentic, it's not really satisfying, because everybody wants to know that you are loved for who you are, not because of your money, right? We want to know that we're really loved for who we are.
You know, as somebody who counsels people that are struggling with authenticity, intimacy, what are some principles you teach that help people to become more authentic, to have deeper relationships with their spouse? What are some of the things that you communicate to them?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think, first of all, it starts with us accepting ourselves, right? We have to, and for me, in fact, my whole motto, personal motto, is acceptance first, and change the byproduct of acceptance. It was only when I experienced that grace and acceptance that I was changed. And we need to experience that grace and acceptance for ourselves. You know, I can think of so many stories, which I could probably get into, but we don't have time, but people who disclose to me things that they struggle with. And yet I know that the fact that they're hiding it isn't helping. I'm not saying that I endorse everything that people do, right? But I know that living inauthentically isn't going to help you either. You're going to feel discouraged, disempowered, depressed, all the D words. You know, only when we really feel aligned with ourselves fully will we feel truly joy and happiness. You know, and the way we do that is we have to find that grace and acceptance for ourselves. And if you don't have other people to accept you, God accepts you as you are.
Have you seen changed lives in your practice, in your ministry, regarding the principles that you teach?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm going to just share with you one story. I'll trade into the details so that, I don't disclose any privacy, but I had one lady, she hated men, and yet she was assigned to my caseload. And I was like, well, I don't know why I'm working with her. She hates men, clearly, right? I guess she went to prison because something bad happened. Anyway, when she came out, I was working with her. I just listened to her, and she every week complained about men. She hated men. And I would listen, and I'm like, wow, it makes sense, because she had been through so much trauma, abuse, domestic violence. And I said, I don't blame you. It's no wonder. And as a man, I'm so sorry that you went through that. And when I said that, she's like, really? You're apologizing on behalf of men? And I said, yeah, I'm so sorry, because that wasn't fair for what you did, what you went through. And I just apologized and listened to her. And you know what? After a while, it's funny, I wasn't trying to change her, but after a while she told me, I don't want to be lesbian anymore. And I'm not saying that I'm trying to change her, this is the cure-all for everybody. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that she found the healing she needed only because I accepted her, or I'm sure it wasn't just me, but she had a community of people accepting her. And that community of acceptance helped her to heal the trauma that she went through. And that's what I'm getting at. The trauma was only healed when she experienced that acceptance. And I can share with you so many other stories like that. And that's why I say it's the acceptance that's transformative, not when we try to change people for the sake of, oh, I got an ulterior motive. Right? When I truly accept somebody, that is transformative. And it allows people to find a healing that they need.
It sounds like you definitely provided for her someone who's just authentic. You were a safe space for her. You were just someone who was listening. And the fact that you even apologized, I think that was probably the first time she ever heard something like that. That must have been so incredibly healing.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of our behaviors are oftentimes reactions. We're very reactive people, organisms. And so we adjust. The composition of who we are oftentimes is the reaction to negative experiences all around us. Caleigh, is there anything you would like to add when it comes to helping people who are struggling and trying to find authenticity to grow in God? What would you say?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I would just echo that. Like, when I had that encounter with the Lord, when I met God and found that He loved me where I was, He wanted so much more for me, I felt free to walk away from that lifestyle and pursue my authenticity. And having been paid to be, being paid to dress up, being paid to be whoever you want me to be, led to a lot of inauthenticity in my life. I did not know who I was. I could be anybody. I was a chameleon. And so it was through finding this love that I started to discover who I really was, and find the safety to be wrong sometimes in discovering who I was, but knowing that if I just keep showing up, and the community that I had that would allow me to say, hey, I just need to confess that, like, I'm struggling in this area, or I'm hurting in this area. That love and acceptance too was the catalyst for that transformation.
Yeah.
Incredible. Caleigh, Dr. Luttrell, thank you so much. This has been just a healing conversation. I'm sure as many people are hearing what you guys are talking about, this is the gospel right here, what you guys are talking about, and the world needs to hear it. Absolutely. We've been talking with Dr. Tom Luttrell on the topic of authentic intimacy. If you have questions, you're in luck, because we'll be back to take questions from our audience, so don't go away. Welcome back to Hope at Night. We've been talking with Caleigh Weichbrodt and Dr. Tom Luttrell about authentic intimacy. But right now, we'll turn to our studio audience for their provocative question. Let's get on to it. Do we have any questions? Right over there.
What would you say to young girls that are currently escorts or currently considering becoming escorts that don't see anything wrong with it or OnlyFans?
I would say that if they don't have a personal relationship with God and there's not that conviction to know not to go down that, my encouragement would be consider your future. You're not going to do this forever. You're going to age out of that as well. Consider what that looks like for relationships, for friendships, for having real community in your life, and really think through the long-term impact of opening yourself up to people and experiences like that who want nothing more from you than just to use your body.
That's right, and I think there's some stats that show that the more that partners are, more someone has a variety of partners, that the more challenging it does become for them to be intimate or monogamous with one relationship. It just there's a connection that's there.
God doesn't say things to be arbitrary. He's looking out for our best interest, and there are good reasons not to do certain things, like you were saying. So, you have to, obviously everybody has to make choices for themselves. And no one's going to say you can't, no one's babysitting us. We're all autonomous adults. You can choose for yourself, but hopefully you choose choices that are looking out for your best interest. And, does that make sense?
That's right. God cares about our happiness, right? Excellent. Any other questions? Right over there.
Can you describe the term sexual sinner?
I don't know if that was a phrase I used because, but all of us are sinners, and sin includes all areas of our lives. But for me, sin is relational. And so if you're not convicted about something, then you're not convicted about it. And so, if you don't know something's a sin, then it's hard to be judged for something you don't know about. So I believe it starts in the heart. And so we have to look at what's going on in the heart.
So like when you're talking about with your walk with God, sin is breaking relational dynamics. These are the dynamics. The law of God is the dynamics that make up of the universe, and it contributes to life and to happiness. And sin, sometimes overused that phrase, you're a sinner, well, we're all sinners, right? We all have faults in us. But ultimately, the definition of sin is something that is fracturing relationship with God or relationship with others.
Right, and I want to emphasize the point that you made that all of us are sinners. That's something that we oftentimes get tripped up on.
Right, right. It's interesting, even the word sin, sometimes we pick particular sins we want to emphasize for people, like, hey, you're sitting here, you're sitting there, but the reality is, look, I got my own sins too. But God's grace with our sins is important to emphasize.
Exactly.
Right?
That's what we need to remember, that the more we identify sins, the more we need to identify God's grace.
Right.
And He covers it all.
And when we're talking about sin, we need to remember that God is convicting people about different things.
Yeah.
When it comes to our walk with God, He'll reveal things as we grow closer to Him.
Yes.
Right? That's God's business. We don't want to be the Holy Spirit for people. Excellent.
Right.
Any other questions? Right over there.
My question is for Dr. Luttrell. Is it okay for a husband and wife to explore sexuality with kinks and sex toys?
So I appreciate the question. I've been asked this as a therapist, and sometimes people are too embarrassed to talk about things. I guess it depends. First of all, as long as it's within consenting adults in a marriage, there's a lot of things that are permissible. But you just have to look at, if it's taken away from the relationship. There's a lot of times people are tempted to take things outside of the marriage, and I think that's dangerous. So as long as you are bringing it back to your partner and you're both consenting and talking about it, then I don't see anything wrong with it.
Right, when you're reading the scriptures, the Bible doesn't talk about a lot that men and women, should or should not be doing within the marriage bed. but it does, their boundaries are within just their relationship. That's at least what's primarily stated.
I want to also add too, the consent is very important, because I had
Mutuality.
Yeah, I had somebody ask me this question: is this sex act okay? And I said, well, how does your wife feel about it? He's like, oh. I'm like, both of you need to be okay with that. That's really important. Would you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say, echoing, is it growing you closer together, or is it kind of adding some division, some separation? Maybe one person is really on board, one person isn't. Or like with toys, maybe it's increasing pleasure, but also increasing dependence, where you're not talking as much about how you guys can continue to learn each other because this toy or this thing makes it easier to get the job done quickly and get out. That doesn't really increase intimacy and knowing who you're married to.
Right. It sounds like the principles, at least we learn from Scripture regarding marriage, what takes place on the marriage bed is, it definitely should be, there should be a mutuality, a consent, obviously. There should be, it's something that's not purely selfish,
Right.
It should be something that contributes to the overall relationship, right? And, it's really fantastic. You read the Song of Solomon book, the Song of Solomon. People think, why is that book in the Bible, right?
So good.
But it's really fascinating. A lot of Jewish rabbis consider the Song of Solomon one of the most holiest books of the Old Testament, and it just shows the beauty of relationship. What's not mentioned in the Song of Solomon book? It's talking about relationship. It talks about, obviously, pursuit. It talks about sexual relationship between husband and wife. But do you know the one thing not mentioned in that book?
Yeah, Jesus, God.
Children are not mentioned in that book.
Interesting.
Which is really fascinating, because sometimes there are some people out there who point out, oh yeah, the purpose of sexuality, of a physical relationship between a husband and wife is for procreation. Well, the Song of Solomon doesn't even bring up children.
Well, and it also doesn't talk too much about God either, which is surprising considering it's in the Bible. But that's why I think that there's the relationship. Some people metaphorize it, they make it a symbol of the spiritual things, but I do think that there's something holy too about our relationships as well. And they reflect what God created us for, which is to have intimate relationships.
Yeah, there's a lot of throwback in the garden with garden language, fruits, trees. It's a lot of throwback to the Garden of Eden, connecting us back to just the holiness that's horizontal as well. Excellent. Any other questions? Okay, right over there.
So lately I've been feeling like pretty empty on the inside and alone. I'm about to reach my 30s in about 2 years. So I was wondering, is this emptiness that I'm feeling because I don't have a family, or do you think it's more of God's way of trying to complete me with him?
I know that family adds so much meaning, but if we don't have it ourselves before we enter a relationship and create a family, it causes a lot of issues looking to somebody else to complete those things. I wish I'd taken more time before getting married to really just rest in my relationship with the Lord and learn how satisfying he can be, learn how sufficient he is to be my all in all, so that then going into marriage and family, I come in whole and complete. And I believe that he wants that for us individually, or if you're already in a marriage, in a family, and you feel that emptiness, he still wants to be your everything, and he's more than capable of being that.
Right. I would also add to that, I think when I look back on my singlehood, I was such a rush to get over that. I wanted to be in a relationship. I didn't really take time, like you said, to just slow down and really understand and fully appreciate that part of my life, because he said, there's a saying which is, I think is true: if you're not happy single, you're not going to be happy married. Right? And so it's good to really appreciate, enjoy that time of life and fully maximize it. But on the other hand, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be in a relationship either. I mean, I think I used to think that was a bad thing, like you're being codependent. No, that's the way God made us. I mean, the Bible says, it's not good for man to be alone. And we know from attachment science that all of us need to be in secure relationships. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in a romantic relationship, but we all need to be in some kind of close, intimate relationship that we can feel, it helps us to feel happy. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be in a relationship, but certainly we should take time.
Right, and that's why the church community is really important, right? Because God designed it to be community for all kinds of people to find things that meet the relational desires in their heart, right?
Absolutely.
So,
right.
Excellent. Any other questions? Right over there.
While it might be easier to be authentic with God, what do you do about people who don't accept you as you are, especially people at church?
I think for me, a lot of us will probably encounter that at some point in our lives, right? Myself included. For me, there's a Bible verse that sticks out in my mind that I oftentimes clung to, and that is Romans 8:1. There's no condemnation, meaning there's no judgment for those who are in Christ Jesus. And that means whenever I felt bad about what people thought of me, I just clung to Jesus. Even before I came up here on the stage, we prayed because I needed that covering. I don't want to worry about what other people think. And, we need that in the church, even and in society. We need to be reminded that, the only person that really matters in this life is God, as far as our opinions are concerned. The only opinion I care about is the one that's going to handle my final destiny. You know what I mean? Other people, of course I care. To some extent, we should all care. But at the end of the day, other people's opinions shouldn't really matter. And that's what enables us to be truly authentic, right?
Yeah.
Caleigh?
Yeah, and when I first got saved and started sharing my testimony, because I was like, oh, confession is important, and I was just like, God has saved me from so much. And some people were like, wow, you've got problems. I was not expecting that to come out of her mouth. It was hurtful. It hurts to not be accepted, to not find what's in God's word about accepting people where they are in reality. But like you said, I had to go back to, I know that he's freed me. I know that he loves me. I know that he accepts me. And as I've continued to walk in that confidence, I've found people who do love me and accept me and see how much God has done in my life.
Right, and there are people who when they do come to church, if you have that understanding of what acceptance like, they need you.
Yes, you can
They need
give
people
it.
like you.
You can
Right.
give the thing that you've not always been given.
Right.
And I have just found so much joy in seeing people's lives impacted by me being vulnerable and honest.
Any other questions? Right over there.
My question is, when you are living authentically, how easy is it to engage relationships that are romantic versus friendship? Would you say it's been easy to have authenticity in those relationships or harder?
I think it's harder because, like we just discussed, people will not always accept your authenticity. But when you know that you are being who you were created to be, there's a confidence and a trust that comes from that's going to lead you eventually to those places and those people who are lifers, who are going to be running this race alongside of you, instead of compromising who you are in a moment so that you can get that love and acceptance. Because under the surface, if you haven't been authentic, they don't really love you or want to be around you for you. They just want to be around you for this facade that you've put on.
Exactly.
And you can only sustain that for so long.
That's right. They don't really, and to be honest, they don't really know you.
Exactly, yeah.
What do you want to be fully known for who you really are, not a facade, like you said.
Yeah.
And it is harder, but you do feel better and happier. And I shouldn't say it's always hard. It's once you've let it get out, actually it feels more freeing, because now I don't have to carry this burden of hiding secrets, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think there's a freedom that comes from being who you truly are. But getting there can be challenging, especially if people didn't buy in the beginning, right? You know, like maybe you started off with a facade and now you're letting somebody know who you really are. But you know, I would say this, a lot of times we don't really, you may be surprised to see that people are more ready to accept you for who you are than you think they are. Does that make sense? Like sometimes we hold ourselves back because we don't think people are going to really accept us. But when we truly allow ourselves to be vulnerable, in a true sense, like going deep, then people may actually really...
We might be surprised.
Yeah, we may be surprised.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Dr. Luttrell, Caleigh, fascinating conversation. I feel like we're scratching the surface, but this is a conversation that needs to take place.
Thank you.
It's kind of amazing to realize that in the Bible, God uses the close relationship between husbands and wives to mirror the closeness He longs to have with us. God desires each one of us to be fully known and to be fully loved, just as we are, and that's where we can find true joy and peace and hope at night. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.